Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode on our Atticus Talks webinar series. My name is James Frith, and I am the former Member of Parliament for Bury North and now Senior Counsel at Atticus Communications. Atticus is a full-service communications company for organisations of every size needing support with public and government affairs or communicating, making sure what you need and have got to say gets heard. Today, I am very pleased to be welcoming a good friend and former colleague, Darren Jones, Member of Parliament for Bristol North West since 2017. Darren is the Parliamentary Chair of the influential BEIS Select Committee, the cross-party group of MPs responsible for scrutinising the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, its wide-ranging work and associated agencies. He also sits on the Liaison Committee, made up of all select committee chairs, which among its responsibilities includes questioning the Prime Minister. Darren's a qualified solicitor specialising in technology law. Before entering Parliament, as well as working as a solicitor, he also worked for the NHS and advised BT on data and cyber security. He's a campaigner at heart, working across environmental and humanitarian causes and on the regulation of artificial intelligence. And chief among all this, I want to tell you, he is a jazz saxophonist. Darren, welcome.
Hi. I'm a bit out of practice. Someone needs to update that on the Wikipedia page. My sax is actually in the corner with my lamp on the top of it at the moment, but it's still in me somewhere. But anyway, carry on.
Well, if we fall short on questions, we might turn to a bit of Blue Note. Today's session is called Post-Brexit Competitiveness, which strikes me is now a permanent state, therefore permission to cover anything with our guest. We'll be covering a range of topics that I know are pertinent to those attending today, and I won't be covering everything myself, so please have questions ready and we'll try to include as many of them as possible. First question then, Darren, let's get underway. You took what seems to me like a strategic decision to lead a select committee instead of taking a front bench role. What do you hope to achieve with the BEIS committee, and what have been its successes to date under your leadership, do you think?
Well, James, you're being polite. I wasn't offered a front bench role, so it wasn't the strategic decision.
Oh,
I should say I was very privileged to be PPS to David Lammy and Charlie Faulkner for I think 3 weeks before the select committee chair election came up. And I have an interesting background in business policy and energy and climate change, so it was a good opportunity to go for it. And I was delighted to get elected. As you know, as you've said, the committee is very wide-ranging, and actually part of our problem really is deciding what to prioritise. And so we have a number of inquiries on the go at the moment. We have this super inquiry on post-pandemic economic growth, under which we're doing a number of chapters of work. We're about to report on our industrial strategy inquiry, which of course the government have cancelled recently and turned to the Build Back Better plan for growth. So we'll be looking at that and the succession to the industrial strategy. We're going to be publishing soon as well, before summer, our report on levelling up and what that means, or what it ought to mean and how that should be delivered. And then later in the year, we'll be doing stuff around the labour market, sadly now not with the Employment Rights Bill by the looks of it, and competition and state aid policy post-Brexit as well. So that's kind of the economic growth piece. We've also got corporate governance and audit reform underpinning that, because there's going to be quite a bit of change in that area. We then do topical work as things come up. So next Tuesday, we're launching our inquiry, having our first oral evidence session on the future of the steel industry in the UK, with the Liberty Steel, Sanjeev Gupta, Lex Greensill thing within that, but also the big decarbonisation challenge for steel and domestic steel production, and how we remain competitive compared to global or companies who might produce it in areas where they don't have the same costs. So we'll be doing a lot of work on that as well. And then, of course, with COP26 in November, the Energy White Paper, a whole raft of strategies that have either come out or will be coming out from government on decarbonisation. We do an awful amount of work on that. And of course, BEIS is the coordinating department across the whole of Whitehall on decarbonisation. So it's supposed to be leading that kind of change, whether it's in housing or transport or education or wherever. It doesn't really do a very good job at it, but as a consequence, we have that wide brief. And then we have a few kind of niche bits that we cover as well. So the new investment security unit, which was only established a few weeks ago under the National Security and Investment Act, now gives the Secretary of State quite significant powers to intervene in mergers and acquisitions, including of IP as well as businesses and assets, where there is a security concern around where that money is coming from. And there was a bit of a kind of debate in both houses about whether the BEIS Select Committee had sufficient powers and access to do that, but ultimately that's what the government wanted, and so we've taken on that responsibility, and we'll be looking at some of those transactions in detail now, whether it's the Nvidia ARM takeover. There's some reporting about some of the American hedge funds wanting to sell off stakes in GlaxoSmithKline. Of course, there's interest from China for potential purchase of Liberty Steel if that collapses. So this new regime of national security and investment is going to take up a bit of our work. And now we've just taken, I was just saying to James before the call, as of yesterday, we've taken on a new responsibility for regulatory reform across the whole of government as well. So huge amounts to work on. And just one piece to mention that I'm particularly proud of in the last couple of weeks was the Mine Workers Pension Scheme inquiry, where basically when the pension scheme was privatized in 1994, there was an arbitrary agreement that profits from the pension scheme would be shared 50-50 between the government and miners who are pensioners. And the scheme outperformed all expectations. The government got about 4 billion quid profit out of it without having to put any money into miners' pensions. And we came to a conclusion where we said actually they should be giving that money now back to pensioners because they're living on an average of 86 quid a week. And there's 1.2 billion pounds in a savings pot, which is also due to go back to the government, which we think should go directly to pensioners. So we're waiting for their response in July, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that they agree with us, because we'll have had a very positive impact on lots of pensioners on low incomes across the country if we do.
That's fantastic. I mean, it's a huge amount of work already. And you were saying in your earlier remarks, you only do a day a week because of the capacity of Parliament. How do you decide what gets priority above everything else? Because I guess with the Liberty Steel, there was a sort of political pressure or political expectation that a select committee that is about standards and scrutiny pulls these people in to ask them tough questions. Do you sort of take a weather check on the decisions you take as to what you focus on, what the agenda is that you're following?
Yeah, so and there's kind of a couple of cogs in the machine really about how we decide that. So as members of the committee, of course, cross-party committee, members put in bids for areas of interest, and we add those to a list. We have kind of a long list of things that we want to do. We then reflect the government agenda. So, you know, having seen the Queen's speech, we know there's stuff coming up, and we sometimes have a particular responsibility to scrutinise things, and we have to fit that in. So that kind of goes on the list. And then we take a topical view, and the Liberty Steel issue is an example of that, where we had to basically push the start of our competition state aid inquiry to past the summer in order to free up some sessions pre-summer to do work on the steel industry. So we sometimes have to kind of shift things around. I'm hoping that when the restrictions are lifted in June, we'll have more capacity for more frequent oral evidence sessions, because at the moment we can only have one a week unless it's a particularly important and urgent bid, whereas hopefully post June 21st we'll be able to get back to the old days where we can have 2 sessions a week on a regular basis if we need to do so.
Excellent. Okay, you mentioned just there the competition and state aid inquiry, and there were rumours that you were going to have such an inquiry. Are you in a position to say what you hope that will cover, and indeed when it's likely to be launched?
Yeah, so I can say that we're going to do it because the committee wants to do it, and so we're kind of gearing up for that. What we haven't done yet is agreed the kind of detailed terms of reference, primarily because of the Liberty Steel issue. So that's been pushed back a bit. But it will probably come as no surprise about what's going to be in that. I mean, the government have got their post-Brexit state aid consultation going on, which I think is still going on. It was a really long one. I think it was 18 weeks. So we'll want to see kind of what the government says around that post-Brexit state aid framework, and probably key to a lot of government flagship policies around levelling up and how it picks areas in the country or sectors or industries that it wants to support in a different or fuller way than maybe they would have done pre-Brexit. So that's definitely going to be in there. How does that work? There's a fascinating discussion about the structure and scope of the Competition and Markets Authority. which has a very expanding remit and comes under the BEIS Select Committee too. And they've just started doing some really interesting work in collaboration with other regulators on digital markets. So there was a statement this week between I think it was the CMA and the ICO on the kind of data and competition issues. There's also this digital markets unit now where they're working closely with Ofcom, and Ofcom's going to get a load of new powers under the online safety bill. So the kind of structure, scope and capacity of regulators will come under that inquiry. And there's a particular interest from colleagues on my committee around digital markets as well. Our sister committee, or part of our sister committee in Congress in the US, did a really chunky report not long ago on digital markets. And there's an interesting global debate at the OECD and G7 around digital sales tax and how you maybe tax companies based on revenue in jurisdictions or not. Now, we won't do the tax bit because that's Treasury, but we will do the competition policy bit. And all of that will probably come together in some form of a broad inquiry that will cover those threads in the context of stimulating economic growth post-pandemic.
There's a lot of overlap with the legislative programme at the moment when you consider, for example, the online harms bill and then the competition work that you've just talked about. And one of the clients we work with is Match, and their concern is very much about the anti-competitiveness of the big players, Google and Apple, particularly around, well, it's anti-competitive in terms of their dominance is nearly at 99%. They are determining the commission that is payable. There is little choice for app developers. Would you like to see or support better regulation to even the playing field for app developers and tech companies that require access to a very much a kind of gatekeeper industry where there is no choice but to use the people that then pretty much make all the rules themselves?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly something that we need to see some change in that area. I don't really have a firm view yet as to what that looks like, but those are the type of things we will want to consider. And in the kind of post-Brexit narrative, it's quite interesting because we sit between the European Commission and the FTC in the United States. Australia is doing some interesting stuff as well, and the UK will need to think from a regulatory perspective where it wants to land in the middle of those kind of bigger players, certainly from the EU and the US. And there are some policy areas where it will be difficult to diverge too much because of the UK-EU trade deal. So, for example, on privacy and data protection. But we may want to diverge a bit on competition policy. And we don't yet know how much scope we have for divergence in that trade deal because we haven't done it before. So there's kind of an interesting analytical assessment there. And then, of course, if we're thinking about a US-UK trade deal or wanting to be competitive compared to other countries around the European Union kind of sphere, we need to think about how we land in that space too. So there's definitely work there to be done, but I think there are more questions than answers at the moment, but it will be something we will.
Do you think that the US-UK trade deal will ultimately shape the scope and what is possible in dealing with the American giants, the likes of Google and Apple, and Facebook?
Well, I mean, under the Trump administration, they were really blunt about what they saw as a tax on their companies in trade deals, and they were quite aggressive in their positioning on that. But under the Biden administration, we've seen a different tone, both in terms of their political appointments, but also in terms of their Treasury perspective around, for example, the digital tax. So previously, when the OECD was trying to come up with proposals for digital tax, it was the Americans that were blocking it, and that's changed since President Biden came into office. So, and they're proposing things like a minimum level of corporation tax globally. At the moment at the G7, it's actually the UK that's slowing down some of those discussions. So I think I think it will form part of that, and there's obviously a desire from our government to want to do a trade deal with the US. I don't know when that's now going to be because Biden's focusing on a lot of his domestic priorities as opposed to international trade deals. But as we've seen with the agricultural issue with Australia, evidently digital and tech is going to be a big aspect of any US-UK negotiations in the future.
Okay, I mentioned in my introduction that you've a history of campaigning on environmental issues. Are you hoping to make your mark with COP26? It's a huge opportunity, isn't it, to be a leader within a policy committee as yours, distinguished. Have you already got is your diary full for COP26 yet? Have you got your hotel sorted out and your hour by hour schedule locked down?
Well, no one knows if it's going to happen yet. That's the problem.
Right.
I mean, so the BEIS Select Committee, because remember, of course, Alex Sharma, who's the COP president, did a job share, didn't he, before he was business secretary and COP president. So the BEIS committee was the committee that led on the scrutiny of COP26. When Alec moved to the Cabinet Office, we maintained that position. So we have an open inquiry and we have regular hearings on COP26 with stakeholders. I'm the kind of I don't know what the speaker would call it, but I'm the recognized senior committee chair. So when there are COP questions on the floor of the House, I get the guaranteed question. So we play a role in the middle of all of that as the BEIS Select Committee. What we did agree to, though, recently was to share that out with other select committees in a slightly more formal way. So normally our clerk between committees would chat to each other and make sure we're not duplicating each other's work, because we don't really have the time to do that. But on COP, there was a legitimate interest from lots of committees, whether it was Tom on Foreign Affairs wanting to talk about the use of diplomats, whether it was the Scottish Affairs guys wanting to talk about preparations in Glasgow. Obviously, Philip Dunn on environmental audit has a huge level of interest. And Alec and his small team wouldn't be able to go to all of them all of the time, because he's got to be around the world talking to different countries. So we've agreed to, we've set up this joint committee on COP26, and we basically take it in turns once a month to do something and share that across the committees. We've also, as a parliament led by BEIS, put into the Cabinet Office to host our own events at COP, and we haven't had a response yet, because I think we're just waiting to figure out who wins the argument about whether COP is delayed or not, and if it is not delayed, kind of what the online versus offline decisions are going to be, and we should get some clarity on that hopefully in the next month or so.
I think the pandemic has meant that people, I mean, it doesn't automatically kibosh things just because we can't all get together physically in Glasgow. I would hope very much that something can still happen online now that we're so familiar with that way of working. When you talk about hosting events at COP, if for example, let's just assume we are there in Glasgow, are you actively seeking input from businesses who have got a story to tell, have got ideas to export, who want to showcase their work that can be adopted by government policy, and crucially, are ministers with ideas that give them practicable examples rather than just announcements?
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just us. I mean, actually, a lot of the headline sponsors of COP26, SSE, for example, is someone I've spoken to in detail. National Grid is one of them, and others. They will also have their own kind of agenda of events and fringes that they will be given space as part of their kind of sponsorship deal, where they'll want to engage with ideas and people and businesses and provide networking opportunities, because actually the bulk of COP is the fringe. The official delegations and the kind of negotiators have obviously got their core job to do, and that will, if Alec gets his way, absolutely happen in person, and they'll do all the COVID stuff to make sure that can happen. The big question is how the fringe will look, and there will definitely be some online fringe. What we don't know yet is the extent to the offline fringe, and therefore whether there'll be a space at Glasgow we can invite people to. But certainly the subjects that we've put in for are related to business primarily, and so we will be having events and spaces and hopefully a bit of networking opportunity to invite people to, if the Cabinet Office says we can have the space, because we've asked for it, and if it happens in person, and we need to wait to see if that's the case.
Okay, that's excellent. Just keeping with environment and COP, one of the attendees today, firm DXC Technology, who are a strategic supplier to the government, they've received praise for in their pandemic work for refurbishing laptops from all of their thousands of clients to hand to schools. And they're making an argument about circular economy. Is your committee aware of circular economy? Is it something, I imagine it's something you are excited by, knowing you as I do. Is it on your radar as a committee?
It is. It's one of those interesting. So first of all, I have a constituency interest, because I have a lot of circular economy businesses in my constituency in the industrial bit called Avonmouth in Bristol Northwest. But it's one of those interesting policy areas where there's a lot of overlap. So the Environmental Audit Committee, which has a cross-governmental scope, has done work on circular economy. DEFRA, because I think waste policy is officially a DEFRA policy brief. So the DEFRA Select Committee has the official kind of lead. And then we, from a business perspective, tend to get involved more indirectly where it relates to other areas that we're pursuing as a consequence. So it's a personal interest. We've not done anything specifically on the circular economy, but certainly when it comes to the question of industrial decarbonisation and kind of how we think about how the circular economy plays a role around carbon emissions. And of course, this is one example, because if you're not making a load of new plastic for new laptops and you can recycle old laptops, especially on the question around rare earth materials as well,
Absolutely, absolutely.
then we tend to focus on from that carbon perspective as opposed to the broader perspective.
But also, I mean, it's quite an exciting emerging area because it creates industries around it, right? So it's a sort of supply chain economy by virtue of SMEs that plug their expertise into the larger economic players for whom are, you know, committing to a refurbishment program. I mean, what the idea, talking with DXC, the idea of being a full life cycle register for government devices. Actually, we could go further and ask, or have a government ask, that consumers and businesses also follow the lead of government, so that some millions and millions of devices aren't just buried in the hills, in the landfill hills. Doing some reading on it today, you talk about the rare minerals. I mean, the UN predict billions of pounds worth of gold is buried in landfill because of the UK's dreadful record in environmental waste. And it strikes me that this is an area where a government that's looking for actually, I think, opportunities to diverge from the EU where they can go above standards. This would be an appetizing prospect, wouldn't it?
It would, and of course, as we've seen in the pandemic, actually, it also helps tackle some things like digital inequalities for people that can't afford to buy a new kind of off-the-shelf Mac, you know, from their local Apple store, but still need to be able to access kit for home working or homeschooling or whatever it might be. And Bristol City Council, I know, has been doing some work on this as well. So they had their standard IT refresh, where they all kind of upgraded their computers, but instead of just handing back the old ones to go wherever, they worked with a company, I can't remember which one, to get them upcycled and then distributed through their charitable functions, which they'd never done before. And the pandemic kind of highlighted the opportunity around that. So I think we need to keep talking about it, because when you think about it, it's blindingly obvious that we should be doing that. It's just that in the past, we haven't been doing it because of the free flow of global markets and kind of maybe not thinking so much about inequalities, but we can clearly do things much better without much effort, I think.
Absolutely right. And there's a sort of responsibility as a developed nation, isn't there, to do that, because the supply chain that you know are making the materials from rare minerals, even to a point of seeing a downtick in things like human trafficking or modern slavery. I mean, there is such a sort of knock-on effect of being more responsible with our electronic waste, or rather minimizing the amount we do waste.
And there's also an interesting national security angle developing here as well, because the Cabinet Office is currently doing something called Project Defend, which is publicly available. I'm not going to get myself in trouble. And they're looking at the supply
Project Defend or Offend?
Defend.
It seems to me there's a bit of Project Offend as well sometimes. But
I think that's more of a political project. But the Project Defend assessment is looking at the supply chains into critical national infrastructure. So like the whole Huawei 5G thing, but basically as it relates to your electricity or gas grid or transport infrastructure or food distribution, logistics and that type of stuff. And we've not got a full answer yet from the government, but if we end up tacking in line with the Americans, which obviously we tend to do, this kind of decoupling in the global economy where supplies coming out of China or certain other countries will end up being reshored or finding other suppliers or other routes to provide those materials. And so if you can upcycle and recycle rare earth minerals, for example, instead of just sending them to the trash, instead of relying on a site in China where you might have some security concerns, then of course that's an easy way for us to be able to do that. So increasingly, from my perspective, I'm seeing the geopolitical context kind of feeding into these decisions around policy and business and investment decisions in a way that maybe a couple of years ago we wouldn't have expected, but it's becoming a bit more frequent now.
So are you hoping for a global BEIS committee? Has anything ever happened equivalent to the sort of G7 of BEIS Select Committee chairs equivalents around the world coming together?
Well, you know how ambitious I am, James. When it came up to COP26, I said to my clerks, let's find our sister committees in every country around the world and have a chat about COP, and see whether we are all happy with our own governments or not, and we'll produce a report summarising what each country has said. There is no established network for committees across the world, and it's proven really very difficult actually to be able to just identify who the chair of the equivalent business or energy committee is, because of course not every country has a committee, and if they do, they don't always have as many as we do, and they may not have one for these policy areas. And so it's actually been very difficult to do that. I'm hoping we will do something at COP26 with sister committees from around the world if those politicians come with us. So we're working on that, but it's proving quite difficult, unfortunately.
Well, we should definitely look to do that, Darren. I might even tap up Leon Cook, the founder of Atticus Communications. I'm sure he'd want to sponsor such a thing. That's going to cost me. Look, I just give due warning to those in the web on the webinar. I'd like to hear your questions. I know of two that want to ask questions, so I'll come to Ty Goddard and who have we got here? Tim Thornhill shortly. Just finally on the issue of Brexit, post-Brexit, are you seeing trends and themes emerge post-Brexit? It hasn't been quite as bad as Ramona's like you and me thought, has it?
Well, I mean, I'm still pretty negative about the whole thing, to be honest. And as you'll know, this is another reason why I'm essentially a backbencher. I didn't vote for the Prime Minister's deal because I didn't think it was good enough. So I had to break the whip again in order to do that, which, as you know, is a bit of a habit of mine, unfortunately. That's why I'm never going to be successful as a politician. But in terms of what we're seeing as a committee, we did a lot of work over that December period with the transition, especially with the haulage companies, food and drink companies, a lot of the manufacturing companies, and it was well reported. There were real problems, especially for companies who have just-in-time manufacturing processes and couldn't get things to their factory in time. We saw the tailbacks of fish and seafood that had to get thrown away, that couldn't be delivered. That was exacerbated by kind of restaurants and hospitality sectors being closed in Europe, but there was definitely a haulage problem. And then it was the cost as well. So a lot of what the government would describe as teething problems around additional paperwork, being able to understand the systems, sometimes additional local VAT payments you need to figure out, haulage companies, costs going up, some hauliers not doing that work anymore, the price of shipping containers going through the roof at the same time. So for kind of importers and exporters, it was a real headache. And I think it's too early yet to see the full consequence, but what I think we're starting to see is a reshaping of some of those supply chains, whereas before they were so seamless, now they're not. And so you're seeing some British supply chains change as a consequence of that and having to adjust to a more domestic focus as opposed to a continental focus. So like I said, I'm still pretty negative about it, but you are right, the world hasn't come to an end, which I don't think either said would happen. But
no, I don't think so. And you can check Hansard. I'm sure I didn't say that. I stopped short. Thank you for that, Darren. So I'm going to come to Ty Goddard. Ty has got a question about education technology, which is a nice little segue between you and me, Darren, as I think I did your podcast on education technology, didn't I? There we go. I don't think you ever published it. I keep waiting for the update from Apple, but I didn't get it.
Sure we did.
Ty, welcome. How are you? Good to see you.
I'm very well. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Fire away with your question to Darren.
Thanks, you two. I thought that was a really fascinating conversation. I do a lot of work on education technology, massive sector pre-pandemic, and has grown, as you can imagine, exponentially. We've got real strengths all across our country, real hubs of edtech businesses, job skills growth, and we were talking to BEIS for a long time about the possibility of what was called a sector deal that was part of the industrial strategy. It's a way of focusing government, frankly, because part of the problem we have at the moment is digital accesses with DCMS. You've got DIT obviously doing the exports. You've got DBEIS who are interested in the industrial aspect. The DFE can't quite decide whether they love education technology or not. So we were thinking about a sector deal for EdTech, Darren. And now, and you alluded to it in some of your first comments, we seem to have no industrial strategy in name. And what kind of mechanisms are there for us to take this forward around education technology? It's been, frankly, really frustrating to try and get government to focus its support on digital in really positive ways.
Yeah, well, thanks, Ty. I think I have some kind of macro and then micro views. The macro view on tech, which is a bit of a soapbox for me, I often couple with the climate view. So as far as I'm concerned, the two macro forces affecting the British economy and indeed the world are going to be the net zero transition and technological transformation. And we have to shape how those are going to affect the design and delivery of our public services, the needs of our economy in terms of skills and jobs and our global competitiveness. And I don't think for a long time we've had a solid enough strategic understanding of what that means from a government perspective in terms of economic kind of leadership.
Yeah.
And the industrial strategy, when Greg Clark put it in, was an attempt to try to start that conversation. So we had these horizontal cross-economy challenges around productivity in the aging society and mobility, as well as decarbonisation. And then, as you say, these kind of sector deals where there was a particular focus on sectors of opportunity and growth for us. Now, the whole point of that was that it lasted beyond political cycles. It was across all of the departments, and that was the only way to solve it. The reality, however, is that it's been canned 5 minutes after it was promoted, so it didn't survive political cycles. And as you will see from my report on this in a few months' time, as well as the previous Industrial Strategy National Council, it wasn't very effective actually at that cross-departmental effort, because you didn't have officials or ministers in the departments that felt like it was their job to push it. So unless you had real evangelists around industrial strategy, nothing really got done. And I'm afraid the DFE was one of those departments where it didn't really play ball, and neither does it really in a good way on decarbonisation and skills either. So I think there are some fundamental macro problems there. To answer the micro questions around, well, what happens after the industrial strategy? The government's still figuring it out, essentially. So I think what they decided, well, first of all, the whole announcement was very strange. It was done in a footnote to the budget.
Yeah,
normally I get told about these things in advance, and the only reason I spotted it was because I word searched industrial strategy in the red book, and I found it at like footnote 63, and I was like, hang on a second, have they just scrapped the industrial strategy? Why is it in a footnote and not a ministerial statement? My sense, this is just my personal view, I don't know if it's true or not, is that Downing Street basically just took it away from BEIS. Kwasi came in as a new Secretary of State, didn't really get much of a choice, and he got landed with it. And if you check his first appearance answering a question on this in the House of Commons, he was pretty grumpy, and I think it probably reflected the fact that this had been changed. And the government's headline view was that industrial strategy needed a rebrand. I think they felt it was a bit lefty. They didn't quite like the concept, but they also recognized that it wasn't delivering. So they wanted to bring it into Downing Street and try to drive it through Cabinet Office committees and presumably this new delivery unit when it's up and running, or re-establishing the delivery unit when it's up and running, to drive it as a prime ministerial priority. Now, if they get that right, I don't really mind whether they call it industrial strategy or not, as long as it gets the right outcomes. But their Build Back Better plan for growth, which needs a much shorter name, didn't really seem to hit the nail on the head either. It was a collection of policies, but no real direction. To answer the very specific question about sector deals, the Secretary of State said that the ones that currently exist or were hanging over from the industrial strategy continue in their current form until we have the innovation strategy coming out later this year, which will provide more clarity around what the BEIS department is going to do around what it now calls innovation as opposed to industrial strategy. Kwasi, to be fair to him, gets this cross-departmental thing, and he did do some good work when he was energy minister on setting up the green jobs task force between DFE and BEIS, and he does recognise that you need to be better on these things, especially with DFE. Whether he has the time or capacity or political currency to be able to make that happen. I think time will tell, but I think he is a bit of an ally on this cross-departmental work. Having said all of that, it's reported this morning there may be a reshuffle in the coming weeks, so we'll have to wait and see who we end up with.
Thank you, Ty, and thank you, Darren. So Tim Thornhill, Tim, do you have a question still you'd like to ask Darren?
I do, yeah. Thanks for this really interesting stuff. And this is something that we've had support from the Department for Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee on, and it's around events insurance. So the UK events industry is worth about 84 billion to the UK economy, and it has a workforce the size of around the NHS. So it's certainly very significant. Now, across those, okay, I know it doesn't all sit within BEIS and it sits within DCMS. But a lot of these are events being cancelled purely because there's no commercial communicable disease cover for event cancellation insurance as it stands at the moment, and so it's absolutely the last barrier for these events to going ahead safely and going ahead this summer and into next year. How much of a my question really is, how much of a priority do you think this topic could be for insurance and intervention from BEIS for the department?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not one that's been raised with me before, and I'm surprised actually, given the stats you've just given me. And it may be sometimes when like a bit sits in DCMS and a bit sits in BEIS, it can fall between the cracks, which can be quite frustrating, I imagine, for you as well as for everybody else. I mean, I think, you know, where there have been other examples where changing circumstances have required government intervention with the insurance industry, for example, flooding, the only way you can solve it is by government intervening and kind of saying, we've got to figure this out. So my gut reaction is you're going to need Paul Scully probably as the small business minister alongside his colleague in DCMS to sit down with the insurers and say, you know, how do we manage this? If he then has to persuade Treasury that there's some form of government guarantee to insurers behind some of this, that's going to be a difficult conversation that takes time. And may not therefore come about quick enough to help. But that feels like the Whitehall route. But because it's often not guaranteed and can be quite cumbersome, it's only really advisable as a route if you've exhausted all other avenues. But it's also worth getting in touch with the DCMS Select Committee, because when they have ministerial Q&A like we do with Quasi, you can kind of put in anything that's related to their department's work and get kind of updates from them on what they think. Have you had any answers from them on that, or are they just saying not our problem?
Well, we have actually. So we've been speaking to the DCMS Select Committee, and Julian Knight's been very supportive on the topic, as have a number of the other ministers. And they had questions to the Secretary of State last Thursday on the topic, and it does seem to be a priority there. But that focuses more on the live music events and sport and the cultural aspects. But if you look at things like weddings and business events and conferences, then that sits firmly within BEIS. And we have been having conversations with some of the civil servants within BEIS. Had one yesterday to talk through the economics of it. So we're making progress, and we know that there is some cross-departmental work. But it'd be great to get more from your select committee, more pressure onto the department to push this up the agenda, if at all possible, because we know how important this sector is for so many working within it.
Yeah, great. Well, look, I didn't know about the problem before, and now I do. So good work. And I'll raise it with colleagues when I catch up with them next week.
Thank you. Thanks, Darren. Thank you, Tim. I'm going to come to Leon Cook next. Leon is the founder of Atticus Communications, and he has a question for you, Darren, following up on some of the very interesting stuff you've said already. Leon, are you there?
I am. Apologies if you can hear workmen in the background. There's a lot of remediation and retrofitting going on behind me, which is actually linked to a question that I had. So last week we hosted Chris Pincher, the housing minister, where we talked about net zero, the future home standard. And one of the things that came out of that, or I have noted from what I've read and seen elsewhere, is how government, joined up or otherwise, sometimes works in silos. So You've talked about it a little bit in terms of COP26 and the run up to that, but whether your committee has seen, taken evidence, or is interested in how BEIS can help ensure that other technologies are part of the net zero debate in terms of, the built environment makes up 40% of all of our carbon emissions and is a massive problem, especially as we continue to build more, which we absolutely need to give people the opportunities to get on the ladder. Do you think BEIS as a department understands this? If you look at the RHI, it is pretty narrow in terms of the technologies that sits within that incentive scheme, and how you are using the work of the committee to basically tell the government you can do more, please.
Sure,
so your
sure.
comments there.
Thanks. I think there's a couple of different things there. So, I mean, in terms of construction and decarbonisation, we are starting that conversation on steel, for example, next week. Still a major component of construction in the UK, as well as cement. And we took some evidence last week on industrial decarbonisation, because the department produces a strategy on that, and we're doing more work on that later in the year. So in terms of how we decarbonise parts of the construction industry, and I think steel and cement actually is still a very significant chunk of our domestic emissions. And so there's questions there about how do you use different materials, how do you decarbonise the production of steel and cement for where you need it, but also are there new kind of building techniques or things that you can do differently to work on that. Our remit kind of covers the first two and a little bit of the third. If it starts to go into kind of building regs, then it's very much an MHCLG committee issue. That doesn't mean we can't do it. It just means we have to really have the consent of MHCLG to do so. And one of the slightly frustrating, but not always problems, is that we can summon BEIS ministers and they have to come. Other ministers can say, well, actually, I've already appeared before my departmental select committee, but thank you for the invitation. We had a MHCLG minister last week, Luke Hall. He had a bit of a bumpy time, so I don't think he's going to come back again. But so sometimes other departments come and talk to us as well. I think there's another point there as well about cross-departmental working, because we've seen this with the Cumbria coal mine saga, where you kind of got Alec in the cabinet office doing stuff on COP, Kwasi doing stuff in BEIS and worried about decarbonisation, essentially with the task across government to drive that, but without any real power to do so. And then like MHCLG from a planning perspective, playing its role, and then obviously quasi-judicial processes at local authority. What we don't have, and I don't know whether this is good or a bad thing, but we don't have that kind of central power and mandate to override any of that, to say, well, I'm sorry, this kind of national priority overrides all of these other considerations. I'm wondering increasingly whether we're going to need to get to that, if we're going to get the scale and pace of change we need to have over the next decade. But I think it would be an uncomfortable thing for the government to do. So I don't know where we're going to land, but I think as we get closer to 2030 and we start to not see the scale and pace of change that is required, and I'm afraid I'm of the view that we're not going to see that unless something changes, then I think we will start to see change at that point, but it's not fully defined yet.
Very complete answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you, Darren. So the chat is open if people prefer to ask questions on there. I've had a direct message from Sean, who says, in Darren's preamble, he mentioned that American hedge funds and Chinese SOEs, so state-owned enterprises, pose national security risks for the UK, i.e. GlaxoSmithKline and Liberty Steel. Two questions on that. Do these investment types pose equal risk to the UK's national security? And what is his committee's approach to other countries' industrial policy? I mean, that's like a PhD right there, isn't it, really, Darren? So
I mean, it's a great question.
Pithy, please. Pithy.
It's a great question. We don't really know the answer yet for two reasons. One, the new regime that we scrutinise has only just come into force, and we don't really know yet how the government is going to use it. In a very unusual way, it puts a lot of power in the business secretary to intervene based on often intelligence or secret information. I don't think it will get misused from a kind of geopolitical point scoring perspective. I think it will be anchored in evidence, or at least that's what I hope to see in terms of how we scrutinize the delivery of that function. But what we don't yet really have a feel of is kind of how that's going to work. And the two examples that were in the preamble there are slightly different, because of course Chinese investment in Liberty Steel, we've already got Chinese investment in steel through the Jinghe Group. So if that's okay, well, why would it not be okay for other aspects? Or is there a concentration of interest that becomes an issue? The department will need to take a view on that, and the government, because of course it has implications for foreign affairs and diplomacy. The American angle was that the hedge fund is seeking to sell parts of GlaxoSmithKline, and we know pharmaceutical capacity is, of course, a national security concern. And so, is that something the government's going to intervene in? What's really interesting here is that pre this act, the powers for ministers to intervene were very, very limited. I think there were 4 limbs under the Enterprise Act, but they were very closed in scope and not used very often, whereas this new act is really very broad, covers a whole range of sectors and a whole range of circumstances, and also gives a long time for the Secretary of State to come back after the deal has been done and potentially unwind it as well. And so how that's going to work in practice, I don't know, but we're going to find out over the next kind of 12 to 18 months. And my potentially difficult job is to scrutinise the use of those powers, where we might not always be able to get access to all of the considerations or information. And so as a committee, we're going to have to figure out how to maneuver around that as well.
Very, very solid. Thank you very much, Darren. In my introductions to you, I talked about your role in questioning the Prime Minister as one of the many chairs of the Select Committee that come together in the what's termed the Liaison Committee. Is that an enjoyable experience, questioning our Prime Minister? And do you think if you had 12 minutes instead of 6, you get twice as many answers out of him?
Well, given I get 0 answers, I probably get 00 in 12 minutes. I mean, I rather enjoy the Liaison Committee, not because it's an effective way to get answers from the Prime Minister, but because it's almost like I don't know, it's like a parliamentary kind of Street Fighter game. The PM comes, like all the committee chairs kind of want to land their punches. They've got their lines, and it's kind of who's going to kind of win in that and getting the kind of coverage on the BBC. Now, whether that's therefore appropriate is another question. I mean, the Liaison Committee should be taken seriously. The Prime Minister should answer questions. That's the whole reason it exists. It's the only committee that can ask the Prime Minister questions. No other committee can call him. But for whatever reason, this Prime Minister doesn't really like to answer questions. And so it ends up being more of a kind of competitive game, which, as I say, I quite enjoy, but it isn't. It's a bad reflection of the fact that it's not an effective route for scrutinising the Prime Minister, because he's not really willing to play ball in doing that. I don't know whether previous Prime Ministers played that. I mean, I don't. Yeah, no, I didn't. I was a chair after Boris became Prime Minister, so I don't know whether I'm unfairly criticising him compared to previous Prime Ministers. I don't know if they're all kind of not willing to give answers, but yeah, it's more of a kind of dramatic. Kind of parliamentary theatre these days, really, than anything effective in terms of scrutiny.
It's very like the bridge in the Starship Enterprise, isn't it? With the General Council of in Star Wars. I don't know who you are in that comparison though. I'm not going to go there. One of the things, I mean, you talked about the Build Back Better and levelling up in your session this week. You tried and tried again to get a definition of levelling up. Are we excuse me, are we any closer knowing what levelling up is going to mean to towns like mine in Bury and others that voted for Johnson last time?
No, but Neil O'Brien, who's the MP for somewhere outside of London, can't remember, who I sat with on the Science and Technology Committee, and he's actually a very credible politician. He's been appointed as the Prime Minister's advisor on levelling up, and there's a new levelling up task force in Downing Street, and his job is to kind of pull all of this together and actually turn it into something that is credible and makes sense. At the moment, there's a few kind of disparate policies here and there, and everyone's been told that they kind of need to think about levelling up in the context of existing policy initiatives, but there's no coherent strategy around it. And the frustration that I had was that we were trying to understand, how do you define levelling up? what's the time scale around it? Is it just some bus stops and a train station, or is it life expectancy and pay, in which case that's going to take longer to fix? Like, who's actually responsible for it? Luke Hall, the junior minister in MHCLG, has levelling up in his list of departmental responsibilities, but it's not just him. So does there need to be someone in cabinet who's responsible for this? And if so, who is that? And what are the measures of success, so that when we're scrutinising it and holding the government to account, we can actually measure whether they're succeeding or not. And unfortunately, Paul Scully and Luke Hall, say from BEIS and MHCLG, couldn't answer a single question about any of that. I don't blame them for that. Basically, they were sent out without any of the answers to the questions and had to deal with the uncomfortable process of not having any answers to questions in front of a select committee. So on the one hand, I felt a bit bad for them, but on the other hand, it was the government's fault for not having sorted itself out yet. But I think Downing Street get that, and I think we will start to see that change over the coming months.
And where does that fit into the Build Back Better jobs for growth that you talked about, or is that perhaps what Neil is charged with folding in to levelling up?
So the Build Back Better plan for growth is a Treasury-held cross-government kind of collection of policies that are supposed to lead on the Prime Minister's macro priorities, levelling up being one of them. What we don't really know is how they kind of technically fit all together. So there's no kind of like overarching strategy and targets for departments, and then strategies from departments delivering on those targets. There's no real formulaic structure around it. What I think, if someone was talking to you from Downing Street, would say is that, you know, geographical inequality is holding back the British economy and holding back people's life chances and opportunities in their local communities, and it probably underpins some of our productivity problems as well. And we have to solve that if we're going to make the most of being a smaller country post-Brexit, and that levelling up is intended to deal with those underlying issues, which I think makes sense, but it makes sense at a political level, hasn't yet been turned into a real delivery structure, and that's what they need to do now.
Post-elections, the latest lot of elections, do you sense a change in the mood of the Prime Minister? He went into the elections probably rather pleased that he could get out of the place with the Lex Greensill scandal, the latest of which. Do you sense a change in mood in the government because of the election results? And is Johnson now, do you think he's off the hook on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think he's pretty bolstered by the recent election results. You know, they obviously took Hartlepool and probably would have done in 2019 had it not been for the Brexit Party, but it's still an important win for them. And they made a lot of progress across the country, having been in power for 10 years. So yeah, understandably, I think he was pretty happy about that. And it's kind of strengthened his position in the Conservative Party. So I don't see him going anywhere anytime soon. I think it's probably more of a decision for him really at this stage as to when he wants to go. And obviously it's early days actually in the lifespan of prime ministers who are not having a bad time. All of these kind of scandals though, I mean, I think they will have a cumulative impact, but I think individually they don't always have cut through. And the reason I think they're happening is because they have such a big majority in the House of Commons. They're doing well in polling. You know, these elections have gone well for them, so they're less risk averse around some of these things and just think they're not going to stick, and so they don't really mind so much. I wouldn't be so sure. I think over time people take a view around that, but ultimately it's for the Labour Party to sort itself out and provide a credible alternative. Otherwise, the Conservatives will just continue to win by default. And nothing will change.
I want to ask you a question about the Labour Party at the very end, but so you can just time me out with your answer. Just on the Lex Greensill thing, the Liberty inquiries to begin shortly in earnest. Will you be bringing Greensill in front of the committee, and do you expect to give him a bit of a hard time?
So we want to call Lex Greensill and Sanjeev Gupta. The slight fly in the ointment at the moment is that now they're both formally being investigated, we have to tread quite carefully as a select committee. There's something called the sub judice resolution, which means that if there's a criminal proceeding happening, we're not supposed to call witnesses, because witnesses also appear under parliamentary privilege, not just the politicians, which means they can come and say whatever they like in front of a select committee, and that can't be used in any way. And what we wouldn't want to do is kind of interfere with any of that stuff. Now, the Financial Conduct Authority is investigating Lex Greensill and his business, but not at the moment from a criminal perspective. And the Serious Fraud Office has confirmed it's investigating Sanjeev Gupta, but not yet in terms of launching a formal criminal case. So we've got a window of opportunity to call them, but we have to decide as a committee how we do that in the most appropriate way, whilst also making it clear that we expect them to give answers and not just to plead the fifth when they appear before us.
Supply chain finance isn't new. Invoice discounting is another way of talking about it. Has it given it a bad name? And do you think it's actually, if the larger players just paid their suppliers better and on time, and we learned actual lessons from the likes of Carillion, who your committee under a different chair did a lot of work with, that supply chain finance wouldn't really be needed, would it?
Yeah, I mean, I think so the Treasury Committee looking at this at the moment, I think there's a case for these financial instruments in certain circumstances. The broader case now is about how you understand and regulate financial risk off the back of misuse of them. That's the kind of question we're trying to understand. And there were some odd scenarios. So the idea that government could pay its suppliers earlier by using supply chain financing is clearly a nonsense. The government can just pay people on time. They don't have to wait for income. They just pay people. So I don't know why that was being considered in that way. And then, of course, in the Liberty Steel example, the thing that is of particular interest to me at the moment was the idea of, I think they were calling it future receivables. So the idea that you think you might sell something to somebody in the future, and therefore you can draw down money against that prospective sale, which may, of course, may never happen. And then this issue with circular financing, where it looked like in the Gupta Family Group Alliance, one group company was selling a container full of steel to another group company and drawing down finance for that invoice, but essentially just moving it around within itself, and then all of this money flowing down. That looks like a financial risk to me, and it's those types of issues that we'll want to think about.
Yeah, I mean, it's no surprise people were calling it a Ponzi scheme when you describe it as you have there. Finally, then, with less than a minute to go, do you think Keir Starmer's got what it takes to take us into the next general election and return Labour to government?
I think Keir understands now the scale of what needs to be done. He's made a number of changes, as you've seen, to the shadow cabinet, to his staffing structure, to the policy platform. And I think Keir is someone that genuinely wants to be Prime Minister, and so is going to want to put the work in to put us in the best possible position to make that happen. He could be Superman. The Labour Party needs to want to change if it's going to change it. You can't just put it all on one individual. And look, I hope that he's able to do that, and I'll be supporting him as best I can in doing so. The next general election is going to be difficult. There's no denying that. But we've got to be putting our best foot forward, and we've got a lot of work to do before we can do that. And look, if Boris is going to call it in 2023, potentially on new boundaries, where there's a net gain to the Conservatives and net loss to Labour before we've even started, we haven't got long. We've only got 18 months already to get all of our ducks lined up, for want of a better metaphor. So we've really got to put our foot on the gas and get on with it.
Well, Darren, that's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to everybody that's joined the call and the webinar throughout. We will be making the recording available to all those that registered, some 250 or so that have registered to be in receipt for the recording. So Darren, really great to see you. I hope very much to be able to have a drink with you or some catch up over some food in the coming months when life returns to normal. And I'll come back to you with some ideas for COP, I think, because I think we've got a good focus there. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. And Darren, thanks again. Terrific to see you. Really impressive stuff.
No problem. Thanks, James. See you soon.
Thanks, Darren. Bye-bye. Bye.